Ma'am, I'm warning you. Move to the rear of the plane or I will call security. The voice rang out, sharp, cold, too loud for a plane designed for quiet luxury. Passengers looked up from their phones, their glasses of champagne frozen mid-air. All eyes turned to one woman seated near the front, Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary, calm, unmoved. Her voice didn't rise, didn't waver. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. What happened next wasn't a scene. It was a reckoning. Karoline didn't argue. She didn't yell. She didn't budge. She waited. And when the time came, she let the truth speak for itself, making the flight attendant regret slapping her. The private jet gleamed on the tarmac beneath a pale afternoon sun, its sleek frame casting a long shadow across the concrete. Inside, soft jazz played, leather seats gleamed, and a tray of imported drinks glided effortlessly through the aisle. Every detail whispered elegance, except for the storm quietly brewing in seat 2A. The wheels of the sleek silver aircraft kissed the tarmac with barely a sound as sunlight bathed the runway in a soft golden hue. It was a plane built for power, designed to carry only the elite, the wealthy, and those whose influence stretched far beyond the surface of ordinary headlines. The engines whispered with controlled strength, and the red carpet rolled just long enough to signify importance without ostentation. Inside, the cabin was a quiet symphony of luxury. Cream-colored leather seats, dark wood paneling, gold-plated trim, and a gentle ambient glow that made every inch of the aircraft feel like a floating executive lounge. Passengers trickled in slowly, dressed in tailored suits and designer coats, their movements casual but calculated. Soft jazz played overhead, and champagne flutes clinked softly as flight attendants served hors d'oeuvres with silk-gloved hands. At the far end of the jet bridge, a single pair of heels clicked with quiet confidence. Karoline Leavitt stepped aboard with the grace of someone who was used to scrutiny but not shaken by it. Her navy blazer was sharp, her blonde hair pulled back with precision, and her eyes, focused and unbothered, swept the cabin with a subtle glance. Though she wore no official badge, her presence alone turned heads. She wasn't just any passenger. She was the White House press secretary under the Trump administration, conservative, composed, and unapologetically poised. Some recognized her immediately, whispering softly. Others took longer to place the face they'd seen sparring with reporters on television or trending after a press room mic drop. Still, she offered no acknowledgement. Karoline didn't walk in like she owned the plane, but soon, the truth would surface that her connection to this flight ran deeper than anyone realized. Near the front of the cabin stood Julia Blake, the chief flight attendant. Her uniform was flawless, every pleat pressed, every strand of hair in place, but her eyes betrayed something colder than professionalism. She smiled warmly at a group of investment bankers as they boarded, even offered a slight laugh at a joke she clearly didn't find funny. But when Karoline approached, the warmth disappeared. The smile faded. Julia's voice dropped in tone. "Welcome aboard," she said flatly, barely making eye contact. Karoline gave a soft nod, unbothered. She'd heard that tone before, at restaurants, in green rooms, in the press briefing corridors of Capitol Hill. It was the sound of quiet judgment, dressed up in manners. She said nothing, moving with quiet efficiency toward her seat near the front of the cabin, 2A, a seat reserved for dignitaries and high-level government figures. She placed her carry-on beneath the seat, pulled out her tablet, and settled in, her posture effortless. Julia watched from the galley, her arms folded. She didn't just recognize Karoline, she resented her. Everything about her, her politics, her calm, her confidence. To Julia, Karoline symbolized an entire system she'd spent her adult life opposing. Traditional values, immigration limits, conservative platforms, and anything associated with Trump. Julia had been vocal about it before, but today, something deeper twisted in her chest. She was determined to make a point. It started small. A second passenger, an older man in a gray cashmere coat, approached Karoline's row. Julia immediately stepped in. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said loudly, voice clear enough for nearby passengers to hear. "There seems to be a mix-up. This section may not be your assigned seating." Karoline looked up from her screen, her expression serene. "This is 2A, correct?" Julia nodded once. "Then there's no mix-up," Karoline said, voice calm but lined with steel. "It's my seat." Passengers glanced over. A woman a row behind leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowed with curiosity. A man across the aisle, middle-aged, briefcase balanced on his lap, looked up frowning. Julia didn't flinch. "I'll just need to verify the manifest. We have a very strict protocol for this section." Karoline didn't move. She merely tilted her head. "Then I suggest you do just that. Verify the list." The subtle challenge hung in the air like a held breath. Julia held Karoline's gaze for a second longer than necessary before turning briskly toward the galley. Her heels clicked against the aisle. The murmurs began. "Is that her? That press secretary? She's on the news all the time. Why is she being asked to move?" Karoline remained still, her fingers resting lightly on her tablet. Her eyes were focused, not on her screen, but on the reflection in the dark glass. Watching. Waiting. She had boarded the plane expecting turbulence in the skies. She never imagined the storm would start in the cabin. Julia Blake returned from the galley empty-handed. No manifest, no explanation. Just the same brittle smile pasted across her face. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Small things, subtle things. A lowered voice, a sidelong glance. The businessman across the aisle had set his briefcase aside entirely, now openly watching Karoline with a mixture of curiosity and quiet support. Karoline hadn't moved. She didn't need to. Her silence had grown louder than Julia's accusations. It wasn't defiance. It was dignity, sharpened to a blade. "Miss Leavitt," Julia said as she stepped back into the aisle, her voice pitched a little higher now, trying to maintain control while knowing it had already begun to slip. "I'm going to have to ask again. This section is reserved. I'm doing my job." Karoline slowly lifted her eyes. Calm. Direct. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "So am I." That answer, simple and true, landed like a quiet thunderclap. Julia hesitated, just enough for everyone to see, just enough to crack the mask of authority she wore. And Karoline knew. That hesitation was all it took. It meant Julia wasn't here to check a manifest or enforce any real policy. This was personal. Prejudiced. A younger flight attendant, Emily, barely out of training if her nervous glances were any indication, hovered near the galley, caught between duty and discomfort. Her eyes kept darting to Julia, as if trying to will her into reason. But reason had long since been abandoned. The murmurs grew. Is she being targeted? This isn't right. She didn't do anything. Julia stiffened, clearly hearing it too. She straightened her shoulders and addressed the cabin with a voice that tried for authority but came off defensive. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm simply asking this passenger to move to the appropriate seat so we can maintain order and safety." Karoline smiled faintly, not out of amusement, but recognition. The phrase was always the same. Maintain order, maintain safety. It was the mask of neutrality used to hide 1,000 private agendas. She reached for her phone. No rush, no panic. Just a quick tap and a quiet message. Then she placed it on the armrest beside her, screen dark. It was enough to make Julia pause. "What was that?" Julia asked sharply. Karoline didn't look up. "Just making sure someone is aware of what's happening here," The words sliced cleanly through the air. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances. Julia opened her mouth, then closed it again. Whatever grip she thought she had was slipping fast. The tension snapped when Julia stepped forward, deliberately close, too close. "Miss Leavitt," she said, her voice strained behind a mask of customer service. "If you don't comply, I will have to notify security and have you removed from the flight." "I suggest you do," Karoline replied evenly. "And when you do, let them know you're threatening to remove the press secretary of the United States from a seat she's been confirmed in." A ripple of gasps spread through the cabin. Someone whispered, "She's the actual press secretary?" Another answered, "Yes, Karoline Leavitt, Trump's communications chief." Julia blinked, her jaw clenched. She hadn't expected that card to be played, hadn't expected it to be real. But instead of retreating, she doubled down. "Status doesn't exempt anyone from the rules," she said, voice tight. "Good," Karoline said, sitting straighter. "Then you should follow them too." For a long moment, neither moved. It was the kind of stillness that made time stretch. Then, without warning, Julia turned on her heel and marched toward the back of the cabin. A flash of red rose in her cheeks. Her frustration was bleeding through every step. Karoline remained composed. Her fingers brushed a small droplet of water from the armrest, a remnant from a rushed pour earlier. Another subtle insult, another missed opportunity to act with decency. From across the aisle, the businessman leaned in, speaking just loud enough for Karoline to hear. "Some people don't realize who they're dealing with." Karoline turned to him briefly. "Sometimes that's the point." She returned her gaze forward, watching the cabin. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She wasn't playing a part. She was simply sitting in her rightful place, one she had earned. But this wasn't about a seat anymore. It never really was. It was about a message. And Julia had just made the mistake of turning it into a lesson. The steady hum of the engines faded into the background as the cabin settled into a strange quiet. One filled not with peace, but anticipation. Julia Blake had disappeared behind the curtain leading to the service area, but no one believed she'd truly let the matter drop. Something in her posture, the rigid tension in her shoulders, told everyone that this wasn't over. Karoline remained seated, her legs crossed, her spine straight. She wasn't tense. She didn't fidget. She didn't check her phone again. She didn't need to. Every move she made had purpose, and every silence she held spoke louder than outrage. Her control wasn't performative. It was power, refined, intentional, and deeply unsettling for those who mistook civility for weakness. Across the aisle, the businessman shifted, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. He didn't look directly at her, but the respect in his posture was clear. Nearby, a woman in pearls lowered her magazine, stealing glances toward Karoline with growing sympathy. Another passenger reached into his carry-on, pulling out his phone, pretending to scroll, but recording just in case. The incident had stirred something deeper than just discomfort. It was no longer a confrontation. It had become a spectacle. Then, from the back of the plane, Julia returned. This time she carried nothing. No manifest, no apologies, no resolve. Only the same tight expression, this time sharpened with something darker. She moved with quick, clipped steps and stopped just short of Karoline's seat, her eyes cold. "I'm going to make this very clear," she said, her voice just loud enough to be heard across the cabin. "If you do not relocate to your assigned seat in the rear of the aircraft, I will have no choice but to escalate this to security." Karoline didn't blink. She tilted her head slightly and looked at Julia as one might observe a cracked vase, fragile, on the verge of shattering. "I've already told you," she said evenly. "I'm not moving. You're welcome to call security, but be very sure you understand what you're setting in motion." Julia leaned in a fraction, her words biting but controlled. "Don't think your position gives you the right to disrespect this crew." Karoline's lips curved, not into a smile, but something far quieter. Pity. "Respect is a two-way street, and you walked off it 10 minutes ago." Behind Julia, Emily stood frozen near the galley, clutching a tray of unopened water bottles. Her eyes flicked between the two women, panic blooming in her chest. She'd seen it all, every slight, every deliberate omission, every smug glance Julia had aimed at Karoline. And now this. Now it had gone too far. But she said nothing. She couldn't. Not yet. Julia turned toward the passengers, gesturing with a hand as if seeking validation. "Ladies and gentlemen, I ask for your understanding. We have procedures that must be followed for everyone's safety." No one replied. Not a single nod of agreement. Instead, the businessman across from Karoline uncrossed his arms and leaned forward. "Excuse me, but I believe the passenger in question is seated exactly where she's supposed to be." Julia's mouth opened, but no words came. The older woman in pearls spoke next, her voice crisp. "I'd appreciate it if we could move on. It seems to me the disturbance isn't coming from Miss Leavitt." More murmurs, more phones raised, not hidden now but held in plain sight. Julia saw them all. She felt the shift, the unraveling of whatever fragile authority she had tried to maintain. Then Karoline spoke again, her voice quieter than before, but unmistakably commanding. "You should think very carefully about your next step." Julia's jaw tensed. She didn't respond. Instead, she turned on her heel and stalked back down the aisle, her footsteps no longer confident but rushed, uneven. She passed Emily without a word. The tray trembled slightly in Emily's hands, water bottles clinking together like soft warnings. Karoline sat still, brushing a crease from her skirt. Her breathing calm, her expression unreadable. This wasn't just a case of a bad attitude or poor service. It had become something else entirely, an exposure. One born not out of confrontation, but clarity. Julia had shown everyone exactly who she was, and Karoline hadn't needed to lift a finger. But the storm hadn't passed. It was just beginning. Julia didn't reply. She couldn't. The words had hit their mark, cut clean, swift, and undeniable. Around her, the cabin was no longer neutral ground. The air carried judgment now, thick and heavy. The passengers, once passive observers, had become silent jurors. No one was clapping. No one was speaking up. But they were watching her. And for someone like Julia, that was worse than noise. Karoline remained still. A quiet knock of knuckles on a metal edge signaled a new presence. Emily, the junior attendant, stood at the edge of the galley with a tray of refreshments. Her hands trembled slightly, though she masked it well. She approached slowly, clearly unsure whether to serve Karoline or pass her by again like Julia had instructed earlier. Karoline turned, her tone gentle. "If it's no trouble, I'd appreciate a glass of water." Emily paused, startled by the softness in her voice. She nodded quickly. "Of course, ma'am." She poured it with care, her hands steadier now. When she handed the glass over, Karoline met her eyes, really met them. A brief, unspoken moment of understanding passed between them. Not pity, not weakness, just human clarity in the middle of a power struggle. "Thank you," Karoline said simply. Emily nodded again and stepped away, retreating down the aisle with her shoulders a little less burdened. Julia saw it from the corner of her eye. She didn't like it. The tray, the water, the ease. It was a betrayal in her mind, a breakdown in the line she thought she'd drawn, one she now saw beginning to blur. When Julia returned, it was with a kind of rigid, artificial calm, the kind people wear when they're forcing themselves not to break. But her jaw was clenched, and her hands balled just out of view, fingers curling against her palm until her knuckles turned pale. She didn't speak. She didn't issue another ultimatum. Instead, she passed by Karoline's row again. And that's when it happened. Karoline had adjusted slightly, one leg tucked inward, the other stretched just a bit to ease a pressure point. Not in the aisle, not blocking anyone, just natural, comfortable, human. But Julia saw it differently, or rather, used it differently. Without so much as a word, Julia turned suddenly into the aisle, too sharp, too fast, and collided with Karoline's foot. The tray she held tilted. A full glass of cold water launched from it, sloshing across Karoline's skirt and hitting the floor in a splash that startled the entire cabin. Gasps followed, audible, instant. Julia's face twisted with feigned surprise. "Ma'am," she said, her voice loud and falsely polite, "please keep your feet in your area to avoid accidents." She wasn't apologizing. She was accusing. Karoline looked down at the wet fabric, then back up, slowly. No sharp inhale, no outrage. Just a steady, deliberate motion, as if she was checking the damage not to her outfit, but to Julia's last shred of credibility. "You bumped into me," Karoline said, her voice low but perfectly clear. Julia offered a tight smile. "Just be mindful next time." The businessman across the aisle stood halfway, visibly bristling. That didn't look like an accident. Karoline held up a hand gently, not to silence him, but to signal, "I've got this." Then she met Julia's gaze, and what passed between them was electric, not loud, but potent. Her next words landed like the weight of a gavel. "I just want to be treated fairly, like everyone else. If that's too much to ask, the problem isn't mine." Julia didn't respond. She couldn't. Her jaw worked silently for a moment before she turned on her heel again. But something had cracked. Not in Karoline, in Julia, and everyone in the cabin knew it. Julia retreated to the galley, the echo of her shoes trailing behind her like a warning bell no one could ignore. She didn't look back, not at Karoline, not at the passengers. Her steps were stiff with anger, but her hands, clenched tight at her sides, betrayed something else entirely. Panic. Quiet, creeping, unfamiliar panic. The kind that doesn't yell, but coils deep inside when you realize the ground beneath you is no longer solid. Back in seat 2A, Karoline didn't move. Her clothes were still damp, the cold water a discomfort she ignored. She sat tall, composed, her posture immaculate despite the stain on her skirt. The businessman had returned to his seat, but hadn't stopped watching. The older woman in pearls whispered something to her neighbor, and the young man filming hadn't put his phone down since the moment the splash hit the carpet. The cabin had transformed. This was no longer a private luxury flight. It was a theater. And everyone had chosen a side. The quiet buzz of the engines did little to drown the unspoken tension. It hung in the air like static, clinging to every wordless glance, every held breath. Emily stood frozen by the curtain, half concealed, her tray still clutched in both hands. Her eyes had gone wide during the incident, more than a spill, more than a trip. She had seen it for what it was, a warning shot, a final petty gesture by a woman unraveling in real time. She stepped forward tentatively, then stopped again, afraid of interfering. But Karoline caught her eye. A small nod, a silent reassurance. "You're not wrong. You're not alone." Then Julia reappeared. Her steps were slower now, more calculated. She didn't speak right away, but when she did, her voice was deceptively smooth, almost too smooth. "Miss Leavitt," she said, "I need you to comply with my request. This is your final warning." Karoline looked at her. Direct, calm, the same expression she might wear in the White House briefing room when asked the same question for the 5th time by a hostile journalist. Unshaken, measured, in complete control. "I've already answered you," Karoline said. The silence that followed was thick. Julia's voice dropped slightly, her tone colder. "Then I'll be forced to escalate the matter to the authorities. This behavior is unacceptable." Karoline didn't flinch. "You're free to do what you think is necessary." That response, calm, poised, without fear, pushed Julia to the edge. "I've been patient," she snapped. Her voice finally cracked. "You're not above the rules just because of your title." "I've never claimed to be," Karoline replied smoothly. "But I expect to be treated with basic human decency. You've made that impossible." The cabin watched, unmoving. Julia stepped closer, too close. Her hands twitched at her sides, her breath quickened, and then, without warning, she struck. The slap rang out like a gunshot, a sharp, vicious sound that cut through the cabin louder than any voice had. Karoline's head turned slightly from the force, a flash of shock rippling through the rows of stunned passengers. Gasps erupted. Emily covered her mouth with both hands. The man filming jolted in his seat. The older woman let out a faint, trembling, "Oh my God!" For a moment, time froze. Karoline slowly straightened. Her hand didn't rise to her cheek. She didn't touch the red mark blossoming there. She didn't even blink. She looked at Julia with eyes that could silence a room. And then she spoke, not in anger, not in fear, but with something far more dangerous. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The words weren't loud, but they landed with precision. Julia took a half step back, suddenly unsure. Karoline leaned forward just slightly, her voice as sharp as cut crystal. "I've tolerated your bias, your unprofessionalism, your attempts at humiliation. But this crosses the line." Julia's breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth, but no words came. The cabin was dead silent now, every passenger frozen in place. Karoline didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand anything. She didn't need to. Her presence alone had already shifted the entire plane. And Julia, once so certain of her authority, now stood before her trembling, on the brink of consequences she couldn't begin to imagine. Julia didn't move. Her hand hovered mid-air, frozen as though time had stalled the moment after contact. The echo of the slap still lingered, reverberating through the cabin like a bell tolling judgment. Her breath was shallow, her posture stiff. She stood inches away from Karoline Leavitt, her authority gone, her confidence cracked, her audience silent. Karoline slowly turned her face back toward the woman who'd just struck her. There was no fury in her eyes, no flash of emotion. Just control. Calm. The kind of quiet certainty that only comes when you know that justice is no longer an idea, but an inevitability. Julia stepped back, visibly shaken. Her mouth opened barely, but no apology came. Only silence, filled with the weight of fear masquerading as defiance. Across the cabin, the businessman had risen halfway from his seat. "Did she just—" he began, but stopped. No one needed the sentence finished. Emily stood near the galley, pale and frozen, her tray forgotten. The shock on her face was mirrored in the expressions of nearly every passenger aboard. The atmosphere, once thick with tension, now trembled with outrage. Not loud, not spoken, but alive in every heartbeat. Karoline's voice cut through the stillness, low and sharp. "I've been patient, but this is assault." Julia's throat bobbed. "Ma'am, Miss Leavitt, I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean to get caught," Karoline interrupted, her words precise, cold, and devastating. You meant every word, every look, every move. You just didn't expect it to cost you." Julia took another step back. Her spine had straightened, but her eyes darted, searching for support. There was none. The older woman with pearls leaned over the aisle, her voice trembling. "I saw it. Everyone saw it. She slapped her. She really did." "She needs to be removed," a younger passenger muttered, still recording. Julia's jaw twitched. Her voice came out strained. "I've been doing my job." "No," Karoline cut in, her voice like steel beneath velvet. "You've been abusing your position. And now, the consequences have arrived." Julia spun toward the galley, as if escape might still be an option, but a voice rang out behind her. "Emily," Karoline said, not loudly, but with authority that turned heads. The young flight attendant flinched, then straightened. "Yes, ma'am?" "You saw everything," Karoline said. "Did you report it?" Emily hesitated. Then she nodded. "I already did. I called it in right before the slap. I didn't know what else to do." Karoline gave a single approving nod. "Good." Julia's face blanched. "Called it in?" she echoed, her voice rising. "To who?" Emily looked down. "To the captain." The words struck Julia like a gust of wind. Her balance wavered, not from motion, but realization. Something in her eyes shifted, panic replacing control. She turned just as heavy footsteps echoed from the front of the cabin. The cockpit door opened. The pilot emerged, uniform crisp, expression unreadable. He walked the aisle slowly, deliberately, his gaze cutting through the tension like a blade. Passengers leaned back to make way as he approached Julia, stopping just a few feet from where she stood. "Ms. Blake," he said quietly, "we've received a report. Is there a situation here?" Julia turned toward him, trying to recover what little composure she had left. "It was a misunderstanding. I can explain." But he raised a hand. Not aggressively, just enough to silence her. "I watched the footage from the cabin camera," he said. Julia froze. He looked to Karoline, his voice changing, softer, more formal. "Miss Leavitt, are you all right?" "I'm fine," Karoline replied smoothly. "For now." The pilot nodded once, then turned back to Julia. "You're relieved of duty, effective immediately. I'll be making an unscheduled landing. You'll be removed upon arrival." The silence was no longer heavy. It was final. The reckoning had begun, and it was far from over. The minutes that followed felt longer than the flight itself. Julia stood motionless near the aisle, as if anchored by the weight of her own actions. Karoline sat still, her breathing steady, her posture composed. The red mark on her cheek was already fading, but the memory of what had happened had been etched deeper than any bruise could reach. She didn't touch it. She didn't need to. Across the aisle, the businessman had given up all pretense of subtlety. His phone was in hand, recording openly now. The others had followed suit, quietly, respectfully, but firmly. What had started as a private grievance was now a public reckoning. A viral moment in the making. The pilot had disappeared behind the cockpit door again, but not before issuing his final instruction. No further contact with the passenger in 2A. Julia had nodded, but her silence said everything. Defeat, disbelief, and a growing dread that stretched wider with each breath. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be making an unscheduled landing shortly. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." It was the captain's voice over the intercom confirming what many had already suspected. A ripple moved through the cabin, gasps, murmurs, quiet questions. No one needed an explanation. They knew. Everyone did. Julia knew what was next. She took a shaky step backward and gripped the edge of a seat for support. The confidence that had powered her through her early taunts and commands had withered. All that remained was exposure, and the uncomfortable truth that she'd brought this all upon herself. Karoline didn't move. She simply opened the case to her tablet, pulled up a draft document, and began typing with quiet precision. Her hands moved with the ease of someone familiar with crisis, except in this case, she wasn't the one in crisis. She was writing something, a statement maybe, or a briefing, or just organizing thoughts while the world around her shifted. That was the thing about Karoline. She never needed a podium to be powerful. Outside the window, the clouds began to thin, the sky giving way to glimpses of land below. The descent had begun. Julia's breathing picked up. She reached for her phone but hesitated. There was no call she could make, no excuse that would hold. The cabin cameras had caught everything. The passengers had seen even more. And worst of all, she had struck someone she didn't fully understand. She hadn't seen Karoline Leavitt as a person. She'd seen a symbol, a political figure, a headline, a set of values she disagreed with. And in doing so, she had made a fatal error. She had underestimated her. The cabin shifted slightly as the wheels descended, the gentle hum turning into a quiet roar. The seatbelt lights blinked overhead, and the flight attendants, except Julia, moved through the cabin to ensure everyone was secure. Emily paused at Karoline's row. "Do you need anything?" she asked softly. Karoline looked up and gave a small smile. "No, you've already done the right thing." Emily nodded, her lips pressing together as emotion flickered across her face. Then she turned away, her steps quicker now, more sure of themselves. Outside, the runway came into view, long, flat, and flanked by flashing lights. A black SUV waited near the edge of the tarmac, engine idling, doors closed but ready. Two figures stood beside it, sharp suits, clipped radios, sunglasses despite the cloud cover. The tires hit the ground with a soft but certain thud. The plane had landed. Julia gripped the back of a seat as though bracing for an impact that had already happened. Her hands trembled. Her face had lost all color. And for the first time since the incident began, she whispered something to herself, barely audible. "What have I done?" But the answer was already waiting at the door. The plane rolled to a smooth stop along the private tarmac, the final hiss of the brakes echoing through the stunned silence of the cabin. No one moved. No one reached for their luggage or unbuckled their seatbelt. Every eye remained fixed on the aisle, the door, and the still, composed woman in seat 2A. Outside, the sleek black SUV hadn't budged. Its tinted windows reflected the fuselage, hiding whoever waited within. But the message was clear. This wasn't a detour. It was a response. Julia stood stiff near the rear of the cabin, her hands folded tightly in front of her, as if still trying to maintain the illusion of control. But her posture betrayed her. The tension in her shoulders, the twitch at the corner of her mouth. She was unraveling slowly, piece by piece, with no place to hide. The cabin door hissed open. Two figures climbed aboard. They didn't look around. They didn't scan for Karoline or ask for directions. They didn't need to. Their steps were confident, direct, unmistakably purposeful. One wore a tailored charcoal suit, crisp and clean with a White House lapel pin glinting just beneath the collar. The other was in dark blue, holding a tablet, earpiece tucked behind his trimmed hairline. They were calm, professional, but their very presence made the tension in the air crackle like electricity. Passengers leaned back instinctively as they passed. Some whispered, others simply stared. They stopped in front of Karoline's seat and dipped their heads respectfully. "Miss Leavitt," said the man in the charcoal suit, "everything is ready for your review. Is there anything you require before we proceed?" Julia's mouth fell open. Her face, already pale, drained completely. Her eyes widened as the implication hit her like a flood. Karoline looked up slowly, setting her tablet aside. "No," she said, her voice calm and deliberate. "We'll handle it from here." She rose from her seat with fluid grace, adjusting the hem of her blazer with one smooth motion. The passengers didn't just watch, they shifted. Something in her presence demanded not just attention, but respect. The man with the tablet turned slightly toward the front of the cabin and nodded once. Outside the window, the SUV door opened. And then Karoline spoke again, not to the aides, not to the passengers, but to Julia. "You made a choice today," she said, her tone still quiet, still measured. "You judged me. You humiliated me. You struck me. Not because I did anything wrong, but because you thought I didn't belong here." Julia's lips trembled. I didn't know." "No," Karoline cut in, her words now cool and precise. "You didn't care." The silence in the cabin deepened. Even the engine seemed to go quiet. Julia looked around, searching for someone to back her, but the passengers who once ignored her were now leaning away, their gazes cold, disapproving. Even Emily, the one she'd trained, the one she'd ordered around for weeks, couldn't meet her eyes. Karoline continued, her voice unwavering. "This plane belongs to my husband, Nicholas Riccio, and you, on your own accord, assaulted his wife in front of witnesses, on camera, in uniform. You used your position to harass a paying passenger, to settle a personal grudge disguised as procedure." "I was doing my job," Julia whispered, a last, desperate attempt to rewrite the narrative. Karoline stepped forward. "No, you were doing what you thought you could get away with. You used your power to punish someone you disagreed with. And now, you'll see what real accountability looks like." Julia backed up slightly, nearly stumbling against a seat. The aide in blue nodded once toward the cockpit. Moments later, the pilot emerged again, flanked now by 2 airport police officers. They moved down the aisle with practiced precision. No panic, no dramatics. Just quiet, authoritative presence. "Miss Blake," one officer said, "you are being placed under arrest for assault." Julia's voice broke. "Wait, no, this is a mistake." The officer stepped forward, his voice firm but not unkind. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Handcuffs clicked behind her back. Her body trembled now, not with rage, but fear. The kind that comes when you realize the damage is done and the consequences are no longer theoretical. She looked at Karoline one last time, desperation in her eyes. "Please, I didn't mean it." Karoline held her gaze, her expression unreadable. "Your apology means nothing without accountability." And just like that, Julia was led down the aisle she once ruled, head bowed, tears falling freely. Her fall from authority had been swift, public, and irreversible. As she disappeared through the cabin door, silence filled the plane once more. Then, from the back, a single clap, followed by another, and another. It wasn't a cheer. It wasn't a celebration. It was recognition. Quiet, respectful, and full of meaning. Karoline turned slightly, offering a nod, not of victory, but of closure. She had not only endured the storm, she had turned it into a moment the world wouldn't forget. And outside, the horizon waited. The applause faded slowly, replaced by a reverent quiet that filled the cabin like incense after a storm. No one spoke. No one dared to. They simply watched as Karoline Leavitt stood at the center of it all, dignified, dry-eyed, her face unreadable, the red imprint on her cheek barely visible now but remembered by everyone. She didn't smile. She didn't bask. She wasn't here for applause. She turned to Emily. "You did the right thing," she said quietly. "That matters." Emily, her throat tight, nodded quickly. "Thank you, ma'am." Karoline didn't linger. She turned and walked toward the open cabin door, flanked by her aides, her stride unhurried but deliberate. There was no hurry in her steps because there was no need. The storm had passed, and she had stood through every gust, unmoved. As she reached the threshold of the plane, she paused, not for effect, but for acknowledgement. She turned back to face the cabin. "I want to say something," she said, her voice strong but measured, caring just enough for everyone to hear. The passengers straightened. "Many of you watched this unfold and didn't know what to do," she said. "You were silent, not out of malice, but out of confusion, discomfort. I understand that. I've lived it." She paused, eyes scanning faces that had once been turned away from her. But silence, when bias presents itself, allows it to grow. What happened here wasn't about a seat. It wasn't about rules. It was about judgment. It was about someone deciding I didn't belong, not because of what I did, but because of who I am. No one looked away now. Karoline continued. "In America, we talk about freedom. But freedom doesn't thrive on paper. It thrives in action, in how we treat people, in whether we hold each other accountable, not just when it's easy, but when it's uncomfortable." She let that linger. "I don't need your sympathy," she added, "but I do want your attention. Because next time, it might not be me. It might be someone without the platform, without the voice, without the resources to fight back." Then quietly she added, "You don't have to agree with someone to treat them with dignity." She nodded once and stepped off the plane. The moment she did, the air changed again, not with tension this time, but with release. Passengers slowly exhaled, processing the words, the confrontation, the truth they'd all witnessed. Some turned to one another in hushed tones. Others simply stared out the window. The SUV door opened for Karoline. Her aides held it as she stepped in, her head still high, her hands still steady. She said nothing as the vehicle pulled away, the plane growing smaller behind her. Inside, Julia's absence was now a shadow stretched across the crew's silence. Her uniform, her title, her authority, gone. Her legacy on that flight reduced to a lesson few would ever forget. Emily returned to the galley, placing the tray on the counter with a long breath. Her hands still trembled slightly, but her spine had straightened. For the first time since boarding, she felt seen. The businessman across from where Karoline had been now leaned back, exhaling slowly, tapping his fingers on the armrest in thought. "She didn't need to shout," he said to no one in particular. "That's the scary part. She didn't need to raise her voice to win." Near the rear, the woman in pearls dabbed at the corner of her eyes with a tissue. "She made me remember something," she whispered. "That dignity isn't loud, it's just firm." The captain's voice returned over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We will be departing shortly with a new crew member joining us. Please remain seated until we are cleared for takeoff." As the plane began to taxi once more, the hum of the engines resumed, but it couldn't drown out what had been said, what had been seen. Karoline had left the aircraft, but the impact remained, not just in the cabin, not just with the crew, but online. Because even before the plane had touched down, the video had gone viral. The slap, the composure, the arrest, the speech. Millions of views in minutes. Headlines were already flooding the internet. Debates were erupting. People from all corners of the country were taking sides, but most weren't arguing politics. They were talking about behavior, about judgment, about the difference between disagreement and disrespect. and about how, in the middle of a polarized nation, one woman in a navy blazer had stood her ground with nothing but her voice and reminded everyone what leadership actually looked like. The SUV glided away from the tarmac, its windows tinted against the world now watching. Inside, Karoline sat in silence. The aide beside her murmured updates, media reactions, legal notifications, statements from airport security, but she barely heard them. Her gaze was fixed out the window, watching the runway shrink into the horizon. The engines of the plane were beginning to hum again, readying for takeoff without her. But the real journey had already begun. In less than an hour, the footage had spread like wildfire. The slap, the confrontation, the composed response. Every angle recorded, every word analyzed. Clips flooded social media platforms, major outlets interrupted broadcasts to report breaking developments, and hashtags exploded. #FlightTruth, #Karoline Leavitt, #RespectNotPolitics. News anchors stumbled over their scripts trying to keep up with the momentum. Conservative pundits called it proof of rising anti-right discrimination. Liberal commentators found themselves unexpectedly divided, some silent, others condemning Julia's actions outright. But beyond party lines, something more human was happening. It wasn't just a political flashpoint, it was a moral one. A moment that forced people, ordinary Americans, to reckon with a question they'd grown too comfortable avoiding. What happens when you let personal bias become personal assault? Karoline knew the answer. She'd lived it. Inside the vehicle, her aide offered her a tablet. "Do you want to see the statements?" She took it, scrolled briefly, then paused. One comment on a viral video caught her attention. It wasn't long or eloquent, just a single sentence buried beneath thousands of others. She didn't fight, she just stood, and that was enough. Karoline handed the tablet back without a word. In that moment, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired, not from the confrontation, but from how familiar it all was. Different location, same story. It never started with a slap. It always started with something smaller. A tone, a look, a quiet, festering belief that someone didn't belong. This time it happened in first class. Next time, it would happen in a boardroom, a school, a courtroom. Unless something changed. By the time the SUV pulled up to a secure federal building in D.C., the full weight of the incident had already begun to ripple through official channels. The White House communications team had fielded over 4 media inquiries. Her husband, Nicholas Riccio, had received requests from executives across the airline industry, some apologetic, others afraid. The door opened and Karoline stepped out, flanked again by aides. But now, security personnel met her at the curb, opening the building's entrance before she could even reach for the handle. She walked with the same composure she had on the plane, shoulders square, steps precise. Her shoes tapped softly across the marble floor as she was ushered into a private conference room lined with screens, call logs, and a waiting legal team. But she didn't sit. Not yet. "We'll coordinate with counsel on the charges," one attorney said. "Assault on a federal official, on a federal aircraft, puts this in a different category." Karoline nodded but held up a hand. "I don't want this to spiral into revenge." The room fell quiet. "I want this to mean something," she said. "We can't just arrest someone and walk away. We have to make sure it doesn't happen again." One of the aides leaned forward. "A statement, then?" Karoline finally sat, folding her hands in front of her. Not just a statement, a policy. Within the hour, she had drafted it. A formal protocol requiring mandatory retraining on bias and professionalism for all airline staff under private charter partnerships. A push for body cameras on flight attendants during official duties in federal chartered flights. A system for passengers, regardless of party affiliation or prominence, to report abuse with anonymity and protection. It was thorough, measured, rooted in the very principle that had defined her on that plane. Respect is not optional. As she prepared to leave, a younger staffer approached her at the doorway, tablet in hand, eyes wide. "Miss Leavitt," she said, hesitating, "there's something you should see." She turned the screen. A new video, not from the plane, from a middle school classroom in Ohio. A teacher had paused her lesson to show students Karoline's speech from the plane. The students watched, quiet and still. And at the end, one little girl, dark-skinned, eyes wide, raised her hand. "She's like a superhero," the girl said. "But she didn't even punch anybody." Karoline blinked. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The moment had already grown beyond her. She stepped back into the hallway, the building humming with movement around her. The world reacting in real time to what had unfolded at 35,000 feet. She hadn't asked to become a symbol, but now that she was, she knew exactly what to do with it. She wasn't just representing a political party anymore. She was representing every person who'd ever been told they didn't belong. And she was showing them what it looks like when you stand your ground with grace. The truth hadn't just landed. It had taken flight. By the following morning, the story had shifted from a viral incident to a full-blown national reckoning. It wasn't just trending, it was everywhere. Major networks scrambled to reframe primetime segments. Newspapers ran early digital editions with Karoline's image front and center, her eyes calm and composed beneath headlines that now reached beyond politics. Grace under fire, the slap that sparked a movement. Respect has no party. Inside the White House, the communications team was already reorganizing the press schedule. Overnight, Karoline had gone from press secretary to public icon. Not because she sought the spotlight, but because she stood still when others might have struck back. And that stillness, that poise, had done what shouting never could. At home, Karoline sat in the sun-drenched kitchen of her Georgetown brownstone, the morning's light spilling over marble countertops and quiet appliances. Her husband, Nicholas Riccio, stood beside her, pouring coffee into a mug that bore the words, "Silence is strength," a gift from Karoline's mother years ago. One of those quiet, ironic things that carried more weight today than it ever had. Nicholas set the mug in front of her, then sat across the table without a word. He didn't ask if she was okay. He knew better. Karoline didn't wear emotions like others did. They sat beneath the surface, quietly burning, rarely spoken. But he watched her carefully, his fingers tracing the edge of the newspaper she hadn't touched. "You ready for this to grow bigger than it already is?" he asked. Karoline sipped from the mug, eyes fixed on the garden outside the window. "It already has." He nodded slowly, thoughtful. "There's a call scheduled with airline executives. They're scrambling. Want to discuss new codes of conduct, offer joint press statements." "I'm not interested in their apologies," Karoline said. "Only their accountability." Nicholas leaned forward. "You've got it. The board's already aware the flight crew was under contract. Liability is clear. But you've turned this into something larger. You didn't just handle it. You shifted the national tone overnight." Karoline didn't reply immediately. Her fingers curled around the mug, holding it steady. Her thoughts drifted back to the plane, to Julia, to the seconds before the slap and the moments after, to the faces watching, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. She hadn't felt triumphant then. She didn't now. She had felt resolved. "There's something ugly growing in this country," she said quietly. "People think that if they disagree with you, they're allowed to dehumanize you, that their political beliefs give them license to cross lines. That judgment is a substitute for justice." Nicholas tilted his head slightly, listening. "This isn't about me," she continued. "It's about the little girl who saw the video in her classroom. The middle-aged father who wrote me last night saying he's afraid to speak at work. It's about the flight attendant who stayed quiet until she couldn't anymore. It's about everyone who's tired of feeling like their values make them targets." He leaned back in his chair, a slow exhale escaping him. "You've always known who you are, Karoline. Now the country does too." She looked at him finally, her voice soft but firm. "Then let's not waste it." Later that day, she walked into a televised interview, not as the administration's spokesperson, but as herself. No teleprompters, no curated talking points, just a woman seated across from a seasoned journalist in a studio buzzing with anticipation. The interviewer didn't start with pleasantries. He leaned in immediately, tone cautious but curious. "Miss Leavitt, you've been called many things over the past 24 hours. Heroic, poised, strategic. Some say you played the long game. Others say you just stayed still. What were you thinking in that moment when she raised her hand?" Karoline didn't blink. That if I flinched, she'd think she'd won. A pause. The journalist didn't expect the answer to come so cleanly. "I didn't want to prove anything," she added. "But I also knew I couldn't stoop to the level she'd sunk to. Because the moment I did, I'd become what she expected, a stereotype, an overreaction. And I refused to give her that satisfaction." The clip aired within minutes of the interview's end. Millions watched. Millions listened. And in living rooms across America, people leaned closer to their screens. Not for spectacle, not for drama, but for clarity. Because Karoline wasn't performing. She was exposing. Not just the bias on a single flight, but the disease of disrespect infecting daily life. And she had no intention of letting the conversation stop at 30,000 feet. The clip of Karoline's interview didn't just circulate, it ignited. In a matter of hours, it had been shared by celebrities, pastors, journalists, activists, and even her harshest critics. It was everywhere. Not because she yelled, not because she fought, but because she hadn't. Her refusal to escalate had become the spark that forced everyone to reflect on how far things had gone in a country where people no longer disagreed. They dehumanized. By nightfall, the internet was awash with personal testimonies. People from all walks of life began sharing their own experiences under the hashtag #GraceInConflict. A waitress in Kansas who had been ridiculed by a customer for speaking Spanish. A police officer in Georgia who had been cursed out in public for wearing his uniform. A nurse in Oregon who was shamed on social media for praying silently during her break. Each story echoed the same pain. Each one reflected the same fracture. And somehow, without intending it, Karoline had become the mirror. Inside her study that evening, she sat beneath a warm reading lamp, the glow casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Her desk was cluttered with handwritten notes, transcripts, and letters, real ones. Paper letters, delivered by courier, written in ink. One was from a retired Navy commander, another from a college student majoring in political science. Both had seen something in her that went beyond policy. Nicholas stepped into the room holding his phone, eyes raised. "You need to see this," he said quietly. He turned the screen toward her. A new video had surfaced, one taken by a teenager seated 2 rows behind her on the plane. It showed the entire moment in a single, uninterrupted shot. Julia's slap, Karoline's stillness, her measured warning, the shift in power, the arrest, and then her parting words to the cabin. "You don't have to agree with someone to treat them with dignity." The video had already amassed 30 million views. Karoline leaned back in her chair. Not overwhelmed, not self-congratulatory, but thoughtful. Because it wasn't about her anymore. The narrative had escaped the boundaries of one flight and was now running through the country like a current, powering something deeper than a trending topic. It had become a wake-up call. The next morning, as the sun rose over the Capitol, Karoline walked into the West Wing with quiet purpose. There were no flashing cameras waiting for her at the gate, no loud chants of protest or support, just the subtle nods of security staff, aides, and civil servants, people who had seen the footage and had made up their minds. Inside the Roosevelt Room, the meeting was already underway. Executives from 3 major charter flight companies sat at the Oval Conference table, stiff-backed and uneasy. Department of Transportation officials flanked one side, while senior communications advisors took the other. The president wasn't present, but the weight of his attention hung in the air. Karoline entered without fanfare, her presence shifting the atmosphere. She didn't greet anyone by name. She simply took her seat at the head of the table, placed a black folder in front of her, and opened it. "Let's get one thing clear before we start," she said, voice steady. "This is not about public relations. This is about public trust." The executives nodded, some slowly, others still calculating. She continued. "One of your employees struck a government official on your aircraft, while on duty, in uniform, in front of dozens of witnesses. That's the headline. But the real story is worse, because it wasn't just an assault. It was a culture of contempt that went unchecked. No one spoke. No one dared." Karoline leaned forward slightly. "From this point forward, we will require that all chartered flight partners conduct mandatory bias training and annual recertification on professional conduct standards. Cabin staff who have previously faced complaints of political or religious discrimination will not be cleared for federal contracted flights. In-flight audio and video will be stored for 60 days, minimum. And any employee found engaging in hostile conduct toward passengers based on ideological bias will be terminated immediately." One executive shifted. "We understand, ma'am, and we're ready to comply. But may I ask, what happens to the employee involved in this specific case?" Karoline's eyes didn't flinch. "That's up to the courts now." The room went still again. Then she added, "But for the record, I'm not interested in vengeance. I'm interested in making sure this never happens again. To anyone." That was the end of it. The meeting adjourned. Hands were shaken. Agreements signed. The air felt different, not just in the room, but outside, where a line of journalists had already gathered near the gates, cameras poised, questions ready. Karoline didn't stop. She passed them with the same calm she'd held through the entire ordeal. Because the slap wasn't the story anymore. The story was what she did after, and how, with nothing but composure and conviction, she changed an entire system. 3 days later, America felt different. Not quieter, just more self-aware. The whirlwind that began with a single act of aggression aboard a private flight had morphed into something few had predicted. A national dialogue not rooted in partisan lines, but in shared discomfort. Respect, once assumed, had become a question. Civility, once dismissed as weakness, had become power. And at the center of it all stood Karoline Leavitt, unshaken, unapologetic, and suddenly, unexpectedly, symbolic. It wasn't just the policy reforms that had everyone talking. It was the tone she had set. Her refusal to shout. Her refusal to humiliate. Her refusal to fight fire with fire. In a culture addicted to outrage, Karoline had held her ground with something far more disarming: restraint. Inside her office at the White House, sunlight pooled through tall windows, casting warm stripes of gold across her desk. A stack of handwritten letters sat neatly beside her laptop, She reached for one, opening it with care. The ink was shaky, but the message was clear. I'm 84. I've lived through war, protests, and presidents. But I've never seen someone make silence feel so loud. She closed it gently, pressing her palm over the words. There had been hundreds like it, from teenagers, from veterans, from blue-collar workers and corporate executives, some conservative, some liberal. All of them echoing the same refrain. Something about the way she had responded had struck a deeper chord, a kind of emotional frequency the nation hadn't tuned into in years. Her phone buzzed. A text from Nicholas. Turn on the television, now. She reached for the remote and clicked on the wall-mounted screen. The image blinked into view, a live feed from a packed town hall meeting in a mid-sized city in Pennsylvania. A local school board had invited community members to speak about respect in education, but it had turned into something else entirely. A mother stood at the microphone, her voice trembling but resolute. My daughter came home and asked me if it was okay to stand up for herself without being mean. She saw Karoline Leavitt on the news and said, "Mommy, I want to be like her." Applause filled the auditorium. Karoline sat back slowly. She hadn't planned this. She hadn't orchestrated a movement. But something had taken root. Not a political wave, a cultural shift. A slow but undeniable reminder that dignity, once seen as soft, was strength in its highest form. The next day she boarded a flight again. Same airline, different crew. The tension from before, replaced now by careful attentiveness. The flight attendants greeted her with genuine warmth, their eyes soft with something unspoken, maybe admiration, maybe guilt, maybe both. She took her seat quietly, no press, no cameras, just another passenger headed home. Midway through the flight, the chief attendant, a tall woman in her 50s, approached her row with a glass of water. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, voice low. "You reminded all of us that our job isn't just to serve, it's to respect." Karoline accepted the glass with a small nod. "Thank you for saying that." There was no dramatic music, no whispered gasps, just a moment between two women, both professionals, both changed by the ripple of a single choice. When she landed in New Hampshire that evening, the sky had turned a rich violet, the horizon stretching wide as she stepped off the plane. The air was cooler here, crisper, the kind that made your lungs feel honest. Waiting at the terminal was her father, gray-haired, weathered, and steady. He didn't wave, just nodded, the corners of his mouth turned in a half-smile he reserved only for her. "You stirred the hornet's nest," he said, handing her a jacket as they walked toward the car. She slipped it on. "Didn't mean to." He looked at her sideways. "But you didn't back down either." Karoline opened the passenger door. "Never planned to." They drove in silence for a while, the headlights cutting a clear line through the darkening countryside. After a few minutes, her father spoke again. "You know, you didn't win that fight because of your title." "I know." "You won because you remembered who you are, and you didn't let anyone else define that for you." Karoline didn't reply. She just looked out the window, the road winding ahead, the sky deepening into stars. Somewhere far behind her, the slap still echoed, but louder now, far louder, was the sound of change. Not shouted, not demanded, but earned, quietly, firmly, one decision at a time. The road back to her childhood home wound through pine-lined stretches and quiet curves, the kind that forced you to slow down and breathe. Karoline sat in the passenger seat, her fingers resting lightly on the hem of her sleeve, the silence between her and her father more comfortable than conversation. Outside the window, white picket fences blurred past, and the golden glow of porch lights flickered in the early evening haze. The house came into view slowly, modest, weathered, and unpretentious. The same white paint, the same rocking chair on the porch, the same wind chimes that sang when the breeze found them. It was the kind of home that didn't announce itself. It welcomed. It waited. Her father pulled into the gravel driveway and turned off the ignition with a click that sounded louder than it should have. They sat there for a moment longer, the engine ticking as it cooled. "Looks the same," Karoline said. "Hasn't needed to change," he replied. They stepped out into the still evening air, boots crunching softly against the gravel. Karoline glanced up at the window where she used to sit as a teenager, writing speeches she never thought anyone would hear. Back when her audience was the wind, and her ambition was scribbled in the margins of borrowed books. Inside, the house smelled like pine cleaner and old paper. A fire crackled in the hearth, and a kettle hissed quietly on the stove. It was as though the world outside, the noise, the headlines, the frenzy, didn't quite reach this place. Not all the way. Karoline walked into the living room, trailing her fingers along the worn edge of a wooden shelf lined with old photographs. Her high school graduation. Her mother holding a birthday cake. A faded picture of Karoline in college, speaking at her first campaign rally, hair caught in the wind, fist clenched mid-sentence. "You haven't taken these down," she said. Her father stepped beside her. "Why would I?" She touched the frame of the college photo, her thumb brushing across the glass. "Because it was a long time ago." He glanced at her. "Doesn't mean it doesn't matter." They sat by the fire that night, the kettle forgotten, the silence full of everything unspoken. Her father sipped his tea slowly, eyes watching the flames dance. "You know," he said, not looking at her, "when the video first came out, I didn't know what to expect." Karoline looked over, brows slightly raised. "Not because I didn't believe in you," he clarified, "but because I've seen what this world does to people who don't flinch." Karoline nodded, understanding. "They try to break them." He exhaled, setting his cup down. "But you didn't break. You didn't even blink. You held your line, and the whole country saw it." She leaned back in her chair, gaze fixed on the fire. "I wasn't trying to be anything. I just didn't want to lose who I was, even in the face of someone else's hatred." "That's what made it powerful," he said, "because you didn't perform. You stood." For the first time in days, Karoline let herself feel the exhaustion. Not from lack of sleep or travel, but from the weight of being watched, interpreted, applauded, criticized. From carrying herself like a banner when all she'd wanted in that moment on the plane was to be left alone. She closed her eyes. "What happens next?" Her father didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was steady. "People will keep talking. Some will twist it. Others will cling to it. But eventually, it'll stop being about what happened and start being about what you represent." Karoline looked over at him. "And what's that?" He smiled faintly. "That it's still possible to lead without cruelty." The next morning, she stood barefoot on the back porch, a mug of black coffee warming her hands. The sky was clear, the kind of blue that feels honest. A single sparrow flitted across the fence and vanished into the woods beyond. The world was still spinning, still loud, still conflicted. But here, in this quiet corner of New Hampshire, it felt like something had shifted. Inside, her phone buzzed again. Messages from aides, network anchors, government officials, an invitation to speak at a university, a request to appear at a civil leadership forum, all waiting. Karoline didn't pick it up. Not yet. She stared out into the trees and let the moment stretch. Because what happened on that plane had started as an insult, a slap, an attempt to diminish her. But it had become something else. Not just justice, not just policy, but proof. That you don't need to match hate with hate. That sometimes the loudest thing you can do is stay still, speak softly, and let your strength rise in the silence. The next week unfolded like a slow sunrise, unavoidable, brilliant, and impossible to ignore. Karoline returned to Washington to find her life already rearranged. The same press pool that had once scrutinized her words now waited patiently outside the gates, hoping to catch a glimpse, a comment, a glance. Staffers who had once kept their distance now paused when she passed in the hallways, some with nods of admiration, others with that wary look reserved for people whose influence had grown too quickly to explain. She hadn't changed, but everything around her had. Inside her office, the desk remained exactly as she'd left it, neatly organized, a single vase of lilies near the window, and a black leather folder containing the finalized draft of the Respect in Flight legislation. Her pen hovered over the pages that morning, not out of hesitation, but reverence. She signed it with a slow, firm stroke, sealing the next step of what had begun as humiliation and evolved into reform. Across the country, airports buzzed with the quiet implications of her act. Training manuals were revised. Supervisors briefed their teams. Posters went up in break rooms, with the new national policy statement printed in bold. Professionalism, not personal judgment. There were grumbles, of course, resistance. But no one dared question the urgency behind the change. Karoline stood in front of the Roosevelt Press podium later that afternoon, the familiar lights washing over her face, the murmuring crowd of reporters adjusting their cameras. She adjusted the microphone with the same calm she had always carried, but this time the room listened differently. Not because they had been told to, but because she had earned it. She spoke with her usual clarity, precise, grounded, never rushed. She laid out the bill. The new accountability framework, the protections, the expectations. Then she paused and looked out at the sea of notepads and blinking red lights. "I didn't ask to be part of that story," she said, "but I'm responsible for how it ends, and I intend to make sure it ends with more respect, not more division." Her voice didn't rise. Her expression didn't shift. But her words landed like a gavel. Afterward, she stepped out into the south lawn alone. The air was brisk but fresh, and for a moment, she let herself breathe without intention. She passed a small group of tourists along the fence, two of whom whispered to each other and pointed. One of them, an older man in a veteran's cap, lifted his hand in a silent salute. Karoline nodded once, solemnly. The sun broke through the clouds just as she reached the edge of the garden. Her phone buzzed again, another invitation, this time to speak at the United Nations Summit on Human Dignity in Public Service. Another ripple from that single moment in the cabin. Later that evening, she returned home to find Nicholas in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, cooking dinner like he always did when the world demanded too much of her. He didn't ask how her day was. He already knew. Instead, he plated salmon and risotto with a smile and passed her a glass of wine. They sat at the small kitchen table as the news played softly in the background. A panel of analysts argued, dissecting every frame of her press conference, debating her rise. Was it calculated? Was it spontaneous? Was it political genius or simply the right moment meeting the right woman? Nicholas turned the volume down. "They'll never get it," he said. Karoline gave a faint smile. "They're not supposed to." He leaned back, watching her for a long moment. "You know this isn't just about airlines anymore, right?" She nodded. "I know. They're watching you now. Everyone is." "Let them," she said. "I'd rather be watched for doing the right thing than applauded for playing the game." Outside, the night deepened. Lights shimmered across the Capitol dome in the distance, glowing like a lighthouse in a restless sea. Somewhere beyond that light, court proceedings had begun against Julia Blake. She was out on bail, her future uncertain, her name forever tied to a moment of weakness she could never take back. Karoline didn't take joy in it. She didn't gloat. That wasn't who she was. But she did believe in consequences. She believed in accountability. And now her belief had reshaped a system and awakened a nation. She stood and moved toward the window. The city stretched out before her. The slap was long behind her now. But the echo of what came after, it was just beginning. The following morning arrived quietly, like a breath held before a verdict. Karoline stood in front of the mirror, buttoning the last clasp of her deep navy suit jacket. Her reflection looked back at her without question. The same sharp features, the same steady eyes. But something had settled behind them, something new. Not armor, not defiance, resolve. The kind that doesn't need to be announced because it lives in your every step. She turned from the mirror and stepped into the hallway, heels soft against the hardwood. Downstairs, the house was still and serene. Nicholas was already gone, early meetings on his schedule, a short, handwritten note left by the coffee machine. You don't have to change the world in one day, but somehow you keep doing it anyway. Karoline smiled faintly, folded the note, and tucked it into her jacket pocket. Her driver waited at the curb. As the car pulled into the avenue, Karoline watched the city come to life. Shops unlocking their doors, joggers weaving through the crosswalks, students clutching coffees and books, all of them existing beneath the weightless assumption that the world around them was held up by hands they'd never see. The truth was, that foundation wasn't built by power. It was built by standards, expectations, boundaries. And somewhere along the way, too many people had stopped drawing the line. That was the thought on her mind as she entered the doors of the National Leadership Forum, a summit hastily assembled in response to the firestorm she had unintentionally ignited. Elected officials, agency directors, educators, corporate executives, even clergy, every seat filled. The air was thick with something not often felt in rooms like this: uncertainty. Karoline moved to the stage without hesitation. No introduction, no preamble, just her. She stood at the podium in silence for a moment, letting the weight of the room settle around her. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but every syllable carried. A week ago, I was assaulted on a plane by a woman who didn't know me. She didn't know my story. She didn't know my heart. All she knew was what she assumed about me, based on my job, my beliefs, my presence. And she decided that was enough. She paused, not for drama, but for reflection. But this isn't about her, not anymore. This is about all of us. About a culture that has confused outrage with bravery. That's taught us that if someone disagrees with you, you can devalue them. That your anger is a virtue, and your disrespect is a badge of your authenticity. The room was still. Karoline's hands rested lightly on the podium, her posture firm. Her gaze scanned the audience, not accusing, not pleading, but reminding. We're better than that, or at least, we were meant to be. She took a breath and continued. I'm not asking for everyone to think alike. That's not the point of democracy. But if we can't even sit beside someone on a plane without assuming the worst of them, then the problem isn't politics. It's personal, and it's rotting us from the inside. There it was. The truth no one else had dared say. She didn't need applause. She wasn't looking for it. I didn't stand still on that plane because I was weak. I stood still because I refused to let someone's hatred make me abandon who I am. And the real victory wasn't that she was removed. It was that I didn't rise to meet her low expectations. Then her voice dipped just slightly, reverent. And that's the choice we all face now. Not just in public office, not just on national stages, but in everyday life? Will you let anger decide your actions? Or will you draw the line, not in sand, but in integrity? Still, no one moved. Karoline gave one final nod and stepped away from the podium. The room erupted, not in cheers, but in something more powerful: reflection. Conversations sparked in whispers. Eyes met across rows. People leaned in, not out. And somewhere, quietly, a woman in the back row wiped her eyes. Outside the venue, reporters waited. Flashes popped. Questions flew. But Karoline didn't stop. She got into the car, closed the door, and let the silence settle once again. That evening, she sat on the balcony at home, watching the city lights flicker to life. Behind her, the news played a clip from the forum. Analysts debated. Social feeds exploded. The world spun on. But in that quiet moment, Karoline finally allowed herself to breathe. Not because the fight was over, but because the tide had turned. Not with force, not with fury, but with one woman who refused to be moved by anything but conviction. The days that followed unfolded like the gentle unwinding of a storm, quiet but still heavy with aftermath. Karoline moved through them with her usual precision, her steps measured, her schedule full, her inbox buried in requests. But something fundamental had shifted. Not just in the way others viewed her, but in the way she now viewed her role. She wasn't simply answering to the administration anymore. She was answering to a different kind of public, one less concerned with headlines, more attuned to character. On a rainy Thursday morning, she stood before the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. The marble was slick beneath her heels, the sky painted in shades of ash and silver. She hadn't come for a photo op. There were no cameras, no press, no podium. Just her, alone, holding a small folded piece of paper in her gloved hand. The letter was from a girl in Utah, 12 years old, handwritten in bright purple ink, the O's drawn like little hearts. Dear Miss Karoline, when I saw what happened to you on the airplane, I told my mom I felt scared because I thought that happens to girls who speak up. But my mom said you didn't get scared. You got stronger. So now I want to be strong like you. I want to speak with calm, even when I'm mad. I want to make people listen, not because I shout, but because I know what I believe. Thank you. Love, Maddie. Karoline read the letter again in the quiet, the mist kissing the air, the statue of Lincoln towering behind her. It struck her in that moment how much had happened in so little time. A single slap had broken something open, not just in the cabin of a jet, but in the national conversation about what respect actually meant when power was stripped from the equation. She slid the letter back into her coat pocket and turned slowly, her eyes catching the reflection of the reflecting pool. The surface shimmered, stirred slightly by wind, but still enough to hold its image. That's what she had become. A mirror, not the subject. Just the surface where a deeper issue was finally being seen. Back at the White House that afternoon, Karoline stepped into the press briefing room to find it unusually still. The reporters weren't shouting over one another. They weren't elbowing for position. They sat, waiting, not just to ask, but to listen. She took the podium with her usual grace and began with updates on foreign policy and domestic initiatives. Then, after a brief pause, she addressed the subject everyone had been expecting. This past week, we've all seen the consequences of what happens when respect is treated as optional. What started as a personal attack has opened the door to a national conversation, and I'm grateful for it, because it has shown us, painfully and clearly, that in our push for self-expression, we've forgotten self-restraint. She looked across the room not with accusation but clarity. The reforms we've passed are just the beginning, but what comes next isn't legislative, It's cultural, it's personal. It starts with each of us choosing again and again to be better than what we're reacting to. One hand in the back lifted. "Miss Leavitt," the journalist said cautiously, "how do you feel about becoming the face of this movement? It's not something most press secretaries face." Karoline smiled, the kind of small, knowing smile that doesn't come from ego, but from understanding. "I didn't choose to be the face of anything," she said. "But when someone tries to erase your humanity in front of others, you have two options. You either shrink or you stand. I chose to stand. And apparently, a lot of people were waiting to see if someone would." There was no follow-up question. There didn't need to be. After the briefing, she returned to her office, closing the door gently behind her. The sun had broken through the clouds outside, casting long shadows across the desk. She sat down, reached into her coat, and pulled out Maddie's letter again. She thought of all the girls like her, all the women, all the quiet voices learning to carry themselves with strength that didn't scream, with truth that didn't apologize. She reached for a pen and began to write. "Dear Maddie, thank you for your letter. You are already strong. You already know that respect isn't something you demand with noise, it's something you embody in how you carry yourself. Keep doing that, and the world will have no choice but to listen. Warmly, Karoline Leavitt." As she folded the note, sealing it in an envelope with steady hands, she realized the moment had finally crystallized. The slap, the silence, the speech, it had all led to this truth. Leadership wasn't about being louder than the opposition. It was about being louder than your fear. And Karoline Leavitt had never been more certain of who she was. Not a victim, not a headline, not even a symbol. Just a woman who stood, and by standing, helped a fractured country remember how. Karoline walked across the tarmac slowly, calmly, as if the wind itself had learned to match her pace. Behind her, the engines roared to life again, but she didn't look back. She had no reason to. The story had already left the ground. At the bottom of the steps, Nicholas waited, coat in one hand, pride in the other. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes said everything. You didn't just hold the line, you became it. Back in D.C., Emily had called twice, once to say thank you, and once to say the crew had been restructured. Internal reviews, new hires, a ripple effect. People were waking up, not because they had to, but because they'd seen what happens when someone refuses to back down. And this wasn't the ending. This was the blueprint. The slap was just the beginning. But it wasn't the story. The story was how Karoline stood still when she had every right to strike back. How she let the silence do the talking. How she turned humiliation into accountability without ever raising her voice. They tried to reduce her to a headline. Instead, she became a mirror. And when the dust settled, those who had mocked her were left staring at their own reflection while she kept walking. The truth didn't come wearing armor. It came in heels, a navy blazer, and composure sharp enough to cut through arrogance. Because Karoline Leavitt didn't shout. She didn't curse. She didn't crumble. She endured. She exposed. And she reminded the world that sometimes the most revolutionary thing a woman can do is stay calm. Thank you for watching. So tell me, where are you viewing from? Drop your city in the comments. I'd love to know how far this story is traveling. And if Karoline's quiet strength stirred something in you, hit that like button so others can find it. Want more true-to-life stories like this one? Click the next video on your screen now. Until next time, stand firm. Speak the truth, even if the room goes quiet when you do.